Hello and welcome to Verdant Works, Scotland's jute museum based here in a historic old jute mill here in Dundee. I'm now going to pass you on to a guide who's going to give you a tour of the building.
So from the courtyard, we find ourselves in the period office. And this was the place where the educated staff would spend their time. So people like young Andrew, who you can see peeking behind me, would be working on the ledgers, making sure that the Verdant Works business was going as well as it should do. Now, some of the things they had while they were in here might not look familiar to us today. Lots of people, when you show them this lovely item here, assume it is to make sure the workforce is working very hard. It looks like something to keep them beaten into place. However, this is simply a ruler. This was one of the things they would use to make sure their ledgers were kept nice and neat when they're working with their dip pens, going into the lovely wet ink that could leave blot marks, could leave lots and lots of mess, and result in people not knowing how much they're paying for or what it is they're going to benefit from this fantastic business. And of course, if you do it wrong, then maybe this stick would be used for something else. Now inside here, you will notice I'm standing next to a very tall desk, and you can see one of these stools here. Now in Victorian Britain, especially in Dundee, these lovely stools were not as comfortable as you might think, because you were not allowed to sit on them. So instead of relaxing and spending your time slouching away like this, what actually happened was if you absolutely must, they would allow you to lean against them and have a little bit of relaxation, but not much at all. You were meant to stand proud and tall, representing your company well, and also making sure you didn't have time to slack off. 100% productivity the entire time in the office. Now, from the period office, of course, you would dispatch memos, even using the modern telephone, to phone down to the docks to arrange for those jute bales to be brought up to your mill to allow the works to continue. And the next area we're going to work into is the batching area, where that jute would come in from the shipyards of Dundee, and then the machine hall thereafter, showing the processes that allowed that jute to become the finished product that made Dundee famous around the world. So, just behind you now. So the batching area, where the jute has been brought into the mill and has been sorted through, it would be a little bit larger than the little demonstration space we have here at Verdant Works, but this gives you an idea of the big, huge bales, 400 pounds worth in weight, would be brought in, huge barrows, and then people like this chap here be working their way through, separating those bales and having them ready for the next stages, which would be in the machine hall. Now, in Verdant Works, we have a number of machines which show you each of the stages, one after the other. Of course, in the full working mills, you could have 50 of one machine, 600 of another machine, but just the one or the other machine gives you an idea. Now, on the night when you come to visit, you will have a fantastic demonstration by Ewan, but I'm going to turn on a couple of the machines shortly just to give you a small idea of the noise and also the incredible movement and machinery involved in creating the jute process. Okay, so that is in the machine hall just behind you here. So here we are in the machine hall. Now this fantastic machine called a softener, built of Fraser in Arbroath, is not the full size. It's about 1/3 of what would be used inside the mills. This was one designed for a training college, the technical college that would allow the mill mechanics of the future to understand how to operate and build the machines. It is over 100 years old and amazingly still works, no longer powered by steam. It has a small electric engine to help us demonstrate the processes. Now, as you saw with the chap next door, the jute as it's separated, it looks quite stringy, it's very brittle, not something you could really work with at all. And in fact, it even makes a noise if you hit it. It's a very impractical material. So this machine, the softener, would start the process of making it into something that you could use. And the way they did that was by these massive metal rollers here. The jute will come through between them on a conveyor belt, and with a mixture of water and oil being spread through this contraption here, spraying down, that'll soak into the already broken and softened fibres. Left for a number of days, sometimes even weeks, the jute would then be much softer, much more pliable, and ready for the next stages. Now, in the Victorian times, the whale oil that Dundee obviously harvested from its whaling fleet would be used in that water mixture. We no longer, of course, use whale oil, we use mineral oil, but I'm not even going to use that today. We're just going to show you the process of this part here. Now, The way I do that, simply laying it onto the conveyor belt, and with a touch of a button, we can show you the jute being pushed through its very first stages in a Dundee mill. And here it is. Now, you have to take my word for it, of course. This is already softer than it was, but there's many more stages before we can start to make it into a finished product. And the next few stages, I'll be able to either demonstrate the machines or just talk you through them. And like I say, on the evening, for the lucky ones who are going to be here, you will have a full demonstration of these machines and the chance to touch and smell the jute as it goes through as well. The next machine I'm going to talk to you is just the next one in the stage, called the breaker card. So from our softener, we come to the breaker card. Now, this is one I'm not going to operate because you need more than one person. It's quite a dangerous machine, this. Now, the jute that you saw coming out the softener, lots of people say it looks a bit like straggly hair. And of course, if you're lucky enough to have hair, one of the things you'll do if you wake up first thing in the morning is brush or comb to get any tugs out. Now, jute, just being a natural fibre, has a similar sort of process. But instead of a small handheld comb or brush, it has the breaker card. This machine, filled with thousands of these extremely sharp needles on drums going round, goes into the jute, rips it apart, the next one mashes it together, the next one rips it apart, and ultimately you end up with this very fluffy slither here. Now, it would normally come, of course, in a straight line. We've bunched it together. But one of the dangers of this type of process is, now, hopefully you can see from this light here, you should be able to see it catching lots of the jute flying down, the stour created by the jute industry. Now, that's incredibly dangerous because jute is very, very flammable. So if you have a build-up of the stour underneath the machine, there's a chance of it catching fire. And that's why child labour was very heavily used within the jute industry. Children were small enough to fit underneath the machines. And so when you have a build-up of the stour, a child is put underneath to brush it out. Of course, they won't turn the machine off when the child's under there, because if you're not running the machine, you're not making money. And so the poor children are underneath here with these thousands of sharp needles rattling round. We know from the accident report book that in the 1800s, a young girl called Bridget Carling was tragically killed inside the breaker card at Verdant Works. Not this exact one, but one within Verdant Works. She was pulled in by her hair, and the Dundee Courier of the time reported she was torn to bits. The process that was to work on the jute worked its way on poor little Bridget. One of many, many hundreds and thousands of deaths and accidents that took place in the mills. These were not safe spots to be. Child labour was used extensively, and one of the other jobs they would do, these cans that you see here, that would be filled with a jute, they would move these to the next stages. They were left to carry the can, and as we move on to the next stages, you will see some of the other machines they would take that jute to. Now, we're going to miss out a couple of processes just now. They just add extra slithers, make the jute even finer. The next one we're going to go on to is one called the roving frame, which is my personal favourite. It's the loudest, and it is also the most impressive, in my opinion. So that one, a couple stages along, is where we'll go next. So the roving frame. Now, this is genuinely my favourite one out of the whole of the machine hall. Now, what it's doing, it's taking those fine slithers, it takes them from the back of the machine, so the cans have been carried to the back, and it's going to feed it through these rollers and spinners to eventually fill a bobbin. And for those of you who can remember your nursery songs of days gone by, wind the bobbin up. This is what you're doing here, spinning up, filling the bobbin with all that lovely rove jute. Now, one of the things that was created from this rove, this material, was slippers for the children of the household. There's lots of material woven, knitted into little jute slippers, known as rovies, and sometimes you will still find people in Dundee in particular will refer to slippers, not as baffies as you might think, but as rovies, and it comes from this machine. Now, when I turn it on, you will see the belt turning, the belt-driven machine. Again, in days gone by, you would have had a steam engine with a big beam powering all these machines. This one has an electric motor, but it still powers the belt. And then I will engage it by pulling this pole, and you will see these starting to spin very, very fast. Now, this is quite a loud machine. I apologise if it gets a little bit distorted in the video, but it is because it's very loud. That's the only way. So, this is the roving frame. Now, the reason why it's so important to do this type of process is, as much as I told you at the very start that jute is quite brittle and quite weak, the processes have started to introduce an element of strength, but you need this twist into the jute, the twist that's being spun by this section here, and it does give it a good element of strength. It's much, much harder to break. It does eventually break. It's not super strong, but it's now something that could be fed through the next stages to give us our warp and weft threads for weaving. Had we not put this twist in, it would just not have that strength. But like I say, it's not quite strong enough yet. It needs one more stage because I can still, if I really try, I can still break the jute. The next phase in the spinning frame will make it even stronger. Now, the spinning frame is an incredible one to see. I'm going to turn that one on as the last one that I will operate myself, and I'll explain why very shortly. So, on to the spinning frame. So this is the spinning frame. Now, all the other machines you've seen so far would be in the low mill, the single-story buildings. From the spinning frame onwards, they could start to be in the high mill. Now, the high mill is an incredible feature of the mill, and we'll see that shortly. It's one of the next stages we're going to go into. But the high mill couldn't obviously take some of the absolutely massive machines on the upper floors. They were too heavy to put in. But from the spinning frame onwards, you could. And the spinning frame is going to just make that even tighter spin that I talked about, that twist that will give it an extra strength for the next stages. Now, this one, again, an extremely dangerous machine. When you see these spinning, it almost looks like they're not moving. They're going so fast. Now, if a thread broke, what you would do is not stop your entire machine, is by manipulating one of these caps, you would stop just one of these moving. Now, imagine if your finger slipped and you're right next to one of these as it starts up. Lots of workers lost fingers, had damaged arms. We have one of our volunteers whose father only had a thumb left on his left hand due to the accidents over time and time and time from working on these sorts of machines. Now, I'm going to turn it on briefly, and like I say, just look how much these spin and how incredibly fast these are going, these large pieces of metal. I certainly wouldn't want to have my fingers anywhere near something like this as it's operating. Now, that finished thread, again, from these bobbins down onto smaller, would then be moved or shifted. The pair wee shifters, the children workers, they would take it to the next stages. So for the warp threads, the weft threads, that would be carried onto the beam, and then finally onto the loom itself. Now, the loom is the most technical part of the works, and it's why I won't be operating next stages. We have a fantastic weaver, Lily Thompson, who started working the mills at the age of 14, and she's now a few years past that date, and Lily still operates the loom for us today. She is the last working weaver in the whole of the city. And Lily will tell you that anyone, pretty much anyone, can learn how to use any of these machines. In Lily's words, even a man can do it. The loom, however, is her domain. Lily's loom, and I wouldn't even dare try and operate that one. But I will show you the loom before we move on, just so you can see this incredible piece and tell you a couple little stories about it. So that's the last one we'll see in the machine hall on this visit. We now find ourselves at the loom, Lily's loom. Now, sadly, Lily can't be with us while we're doing this work. Lily is recovering from an operation, and she'll be out for a few weeks, but I really do recommend trying to come when she's back. It is an incredible experience to hear from a true weaver herself. Now, the loom is very loud, it's very dangerous. There's a safety guard just next to me because sometimes one of the amazing things is these shuttles that would fly backwards and forwards across the loom, picking the thread through for your woven material with these sharp picks to help it make its way through, would come off its rail and up through the mill. So it is an incredibly dangerous thing, even being next to what you think would be the finished product, probably less dangerous. It definitely was not. Now, a couple of things that Lily told me of stories of her time in the mill. When she started at the age of 14, she was in charge of 2 looms, one in front and one behind. And you would go between the 2, trying to keep them constantly working. You were paid by the amount of material you created. There's a small counter built into the loom that would allow you to know how much cloth had been created. Now, Lily will tell you of much, much later into the years when somebody invented the self-loading shuttle. So when she first started, she would have to lift the metal clip, load a new cop, one of these fantastic pieces here, load one in, close it over and start again. Of course, that takes time. The self-loading shuttle was invented, as Lily will tell you, it was invented by a man to make things more difficult for a woman. What happened was this loom with the self-loading shuttle never had to stop. The shuttle would be loaded by the cop on an automatic feeder every time it was empty. But because it didn't have to stop and you weren't having to load the shuttle by hand, what happened was instead of being in charge of the loom in front of you and the loom behind you, you then became in charge of 6 looms, all operating at exactly the same time, having to run up and down 3 and 3 all day, hour after hour, with only one break the whole day. Now, you can just about make out in the photograph behind me here one of these weaving sheds. The biggest in Dundee had over 600 looms, all operating at exactly the same time. It's said that the wall of sound that came from these was so intense that if you weren't prepared as you walked into the shed, you wouldn't be able to catch your breath. You would actually be physically unable to breathe from the sheer wall of sound. It's incredible that people even went through this. In Dundee, at its height, the jute industry had a population of over 50,000 involved. And that's people from everything from the dock workers delivering the jute, the dray carts bringing the jute up, or even people like Lily, of course, working on the loom. 50,000 people involved in the industry. And now, the machine hall here, where you can see people like Lily operating, our other fantastic volunteers, and people showing you these machines, this is the only place in the whole of Western Europe you will still see these processes. And industry is gone in such a short space of time. And that's why it's so incredible we have these machines here and able to tell the story in the wonderful Verdant works. Now, the next stage we're going to go through to is into other sections of the mill, including the high mill, the fantastic steam engine that we have, and also a couple other very important parts of the social side of the mill. But I do recommend coming in to see these machines in person. They really are incredible. We know how they made woven jute, but what did they actually use the jute for, and why was it so important? Well, jute was used for hundreds and hundreds of products around the world. Today, it's probably most commonly known for things like bags for life. So if you go to supermarkets, those woven bags with that lovely sweet smell, that's jute. And also, it's fantastic if you're a gardener. Jute biodegrades within about 3 months, so it's very good as a frost protector, and then just mulches down nicely to give you extra fertilised ground for the next season. But jute was used for sandbags, for sacking, for transportation, for ropes. You could make sailcloth out of jute, especially if you treated it. Jute was even waterproof. This gives you an idea of some of the things, this demonstration we have here. If you had linoleum in your kitchen normally, it was backed with jute. Axminster carpet, some of the most expensive carpets on the planet, was Dundee jute backing. And some of the more amazing things that probably weren't so known about, even the pioneer wagons as people went across the US, it was jute covers, jute tents. Dundee lays claim to be able to sell to both sides of the American Civil War. And they even played them off against each other, saying one was paying more, and the other one didn't want to seem to be cheap, and they kept managing to raise the price. It was a fantastic time for Dundee. It's one of these odd situations where war, sadly, was actually a boon time for Dundee in as much as there was a demand for jute and its properties. And from all those incredibly practical uses of jute, jute was also used in fashion. And this skirt here on this mannequin is a really special one. It was designed by Mary Quant, who lots of you will know from the Mary Quant exhibit at the V&A Dundee just recently. But we were the first ones in Dundee to have a Mary Quant exhibit in this one skirt. This was part of her budget range that she was working on, experimenting with different materials. And in the 1960s, jute was one of the ones she went on. So an incredible, beautiful piece, and shows just the versatility of jute. Now, sadly, as I told you, the jute industry did decline in Dundee, and now we are the only place where you can see that happening. And what we're going to finish off in this area is just quickly showing you how many mills there used to be in Dundee and what we now have. So this map here, with all these lovely dots, this shows us the full extent of the mills in Dundee in their heyday. This is from 1860 to 1870. Now we are here, this little orange square, allowing you to see that we were quite smack bang in the centre. If you remember when we were in the courtyard, I was telling you about the scouring burn and the reason why the mills were clustered together. You can see just how clustered they were around the scouring burn area. Now, the other ones dotted along, it's all water courses, keeping them in the same place. And as I say, sadly, this is now the only place you'll see jute produced. Lots have now been turned over for housing, or other purposes, business use, but sadly, lots of the buildings have been lost to the mists of time, and those fantastic grand buildings are no longer with the city. Now, we're going to move on into the High Mill section, which is one of the grandest spaces, but also, strangely, one of the most recent ones the public would see at Verdant Works, just after a 2015 massive project to reopen. So let's make our way over to the High Mill and its glory within the steam engine. So we find ourselves now in the High Mill, the grand three-storey space, so the ground floor, first floor and attic floor way above us, which houses now the brilliant Bolton and Watt beam engine, which dates back even older than Verdant Works time. The High Mill section is the oldest part of Verdant Works, dating back to 1833. It's been changed a few times since then, and like I say, it's only been reopened to the public since 2015 after the High Mill project to save this fantastic piece of architecture. But the Bolton and Watt that dates back to 1801, one of the very few steam engines of that era that still sits in the city that it was built for. It was originally built for the bleach works, the Douglasfield Bleach Works. For a time sat up in the Industrial Museum of the city, up at Duddup Castle, but now proudly stands here. Now this is an incredible piece of kit. I'm going to turn it on shortly. Now we don't use steam because if we did, I would have to wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning and power up a big huge boiler, and I don't want to do that. So instead, a little electric motor allows us to power this fantastic machine. Now the first things you'll see happening are, from this side of the machine, you will see these two gears here, the sun and planet gears, with the sun gear sitting in the center with the planet gear going around, and this movement will transfer through to the giant flywheel you see at the back. So that's the first things to watch for as I start it. Now this fantastic piece of work is even controlled by its own mechanism. If you can see up above me here, what looks like two cannonballs sitting in a little bracket, it's called the governor, and the governor governs the speed, and it works on centrifugal force. If the engine starts to speed up and turn too fast, the centrifugal force will pull these out to the side. By doing that, it will pull and release on a valve over at the top of the cylinder, releasing the steam up into the air. Because the steam is going up into the air, it's not going into the cylinder, not moving the piston, not turning the gears, not turning the flywheel. The whole thing slows down again. The governor moves back into place and it resets. From 1801, they had an almost entirely automatic engine, an incredible piece of engineering. Now this would power the hundreds up to thousands of machines within the mill. Some other mills, the biggest ones, would have way more than just one steam engine, but it was through these engines that the industry that made Dundee very wealthy, or some people in some parts of Dundee very wealthy, and allowed for Dundee's product to be spread around the world from things just like this. I really do recommend coming to see this in operation in person. It really is quite mesmerising to see it working. Now, I'm going to turn this one off, and we're going to make our way up to the tallest part of the mill, the attic floor, and think about life now away from the working side of the mills and just the odd occasion where you might have had some enjoyment or at least just downtime from working. So to start our time away from the working area of the mill, we've come further up in the mill. We've come up to the attic floor. Now, the attic floor of Verdant Works, and the attic floor of all mills, wasn't a storage space like we sometimes think of attics now, where you just dump all your Christmas decorations on the first. This is where you had still a working floor, which is why you have all these lovely skylights bringing in lots of natural light and some fresh air, if you were lucky, to help the workers with their jobs. But Verdant Works attic has one nice non-work related story to tell. Now, back in the 1850s, tragically, Verdant Works had a massive fire, and it meant that the attic floor and part of the first floor was severely burned. A few years later, they'd raised enough money and enough time to rebuild that section of the mill. They built a little bit higher than it had been, and then what they moved on to was a big open floor ready for the machines to be brought into. Now, just by sheer chance, this newly rebuilt attic floor was completed without the machines just in time for a New Year's party. And so that's what they did. They celebrated up here. The owners of the mill arranged for these big, huge columns to be decorated with holly and ivy. They arranged for singers and musicians and for food and for drink and for speeches and songs. And for one night only, up here in this attic floor of Verdant Works, the workers, all 500, had a party. An almost unheard of thing inside the Dundee mills. All those workers celebrating and enjoying. A very Dickensian type scene. Now, of course, almost immediately after that party, clear away all the decorations and get set for work. But it was such an amazing event, the Dundee Courier reported about what happened, and thanks to that we know that the event took place. We know the types of things that were danced to, the types of songs that were sung. We know who said what. We have the names of some of the people involved. All thanks to it being such an unusual event, it was worthy of being recorded in the press. Now, you did get some other nice things in your times in the mill. Sometimes you went on picnics as workers' days out, but most of the time your time away from the mill was focused around the home. And so that's what we're going to look at next, is what it was like for life as a worker back home. So your brief respite away from work would be going home to the family. Now, of course, we all live in nice houses nowadays with fresh running water, hot and cold, and normally, certainly for most of us, indoor toilets. You didn't have such luxuries like that in the slum areas of the city centre of Dundee, where most of the workers would spend their time away from work. You would sometimes have people living 8 to a room. You could have 40 people sharing the one outdoor toilet, which of course wasn't plumbed, just went into a pit into the ground, which at times would have to be emptied out by shovel and hand. And of course the food, the drink, the water was hardly anything to write home about. Cholera, massive epidemics, were spreading across the city, and the workers getting weaker and weaker and poorer and poorer. The jute mills did make a lot of people very wealthy, but they did lead to this perpetuation of poverty and difficulty within the city. Now, those workers did have some fun times. They had games that they would play out in the street, of course not worrying about cars in those days, barefoot children running out and enjoying the time that they could have away from work or from school. Those who would go part-time, the halflings, the part-timers who would go normally to schools run by the mills themselves, but you would also have them coming in and helping out with the chores inside the house, so washing up, cleaning up the house. And different to pretty much anywhere else in the industrial world, the workers were the women, and the ones staying at home looking after those younger children and doing the chores were the men. Dundee had a matriarchal society. The women were the head of the household and went out to work, and the men, known as kipplers, would stay at home and cook and clean and look after the youngest children. And it's not for fantastic reasons of Dundee being more equal or trying to do things differently. It was simply because you could pay women less, and in general, women being a little bit smaller than men, you could push machines even closer together, fitting even more into your mill, meaning you could produce more jute and become even more wealthy. So Dundee, the workers, were taken advantage of in that way. Women and children workers and the men staying at home. A very different situation than anywhere else in the industrial world. Now, you did have a couple of away days if you were lucky. The picnic, maybe a trip to the beach, Broughty Ferry, not far from here. You would be able to get a journey down there if you were lucky. A little bit of play on the beach before home time. Now, when you come up to this area of the mill, the social history gallery, you will learn much more about the diet, the healthcare of what it was, and also little breaks away. And you'll also learn a lot about the suffragette movement. Because Dundee had the matriarchal society, it had a very militant female population who were out to try and change things for the better. And they did that by being very, very inventive and at times very, very aggressive in their actions. And you will learn lots about them in this area here. So the social side here finishes up our story of Verdant Works, which started down in the courtyard and the story of why the mill was here in the first place, through to the jute, the processes, the big massive engine that powered those machines, and now the thoughts of those workers themselves that really did make the city and has left a legacy of why Dundee, such a unique culture, such a fantastic spirit from those workers back in the Victorian times, leaving their legacy on the city. I hope you've enjoyed your little virtual tour of Verdant Works, and I hope you will enjoy visiting in person very soon. Okay, thank you.